Hello, everyone. My name is Rafal, and I would like to welcome everyone to my Headshot Photography podcast. Today, I have a very special guest. Karl Taylor is in the house. We've spoke briefly before we went live, and as I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of your work. As I said, when I started my photography journey, you were one of those people who were sharing your knowledge, providing content with all this valuable informations. And I even remember one of the days when I went to the camera store. It's like a local, like a place where you buy all the equipment and stuff. And then your DVDs, I think at that time, I don't know, they
Right,
were
yeah.
like they're selling them over there. So like this is how far that's gone, where you
Yes,
had.
yeah, that would have been some time ago, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember I purchased them and watched them over and over and over again because like when you were showing this stuff, everything kind of looked really easy, and you set up your light, boom, you're showing the shot. It's like, oh my god, this is like the best thing ever. And then when we are trying to do this or replicate it, it's a completely different story. But you gave, I think, a lot of people, including myself, like a really solid foundation,
Thank you.
how to push photography to more, I would say, professional level. And then we could just kind of, because also I remember at that time, there's not much education content out there, right? Like you really have
No, not
to.
when we first started, no. Obviously, there's been quite a lot since, but no, when we started doing this, I think it was back in 2007
Yeah.
on the education side. I mean, I've been a photographer professionally since the early 90s, but it was 2007, I think we started our education side of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to say welcome, and thank you for, as I said, accepting my invitation. And
No
I'm
problem.
really
Thanks for
truly
having me.
honored to have you and talk to you. So typically I start my podcasts with basically diving into how this whole story starts for you, because I know a lot of photographers out there, they have kind of different approach. They start photography different ways. Sometimes they have different professions, and all of a sudden they discover like, oh, I want to be a photographer. So tell me your story. How did you get into photography? How this whole thing started? And the second part of my question is like, how this whole thing turned into professional job? Because like you've been doing this professionally for many many years, and I
Mm.
know it's not easy to switch for a lot of people, right? Like getting into that business, it's a hard work, and maintaining this is another story, but that's what we're going to talk a little bit later, because I want to also really dive in into the business side of the photography, because that's
Sure,
where people struggle the
sure.
most. But let's start, tell me a little more about your story. How did you get into this whole thing?
Okay, so at school, I was very much into art, drawing, painting, and pretty good at it as well. And then I left school actually at 16 years old and went straight into employment. And I went into interior design as a sketch artist
Oh
for
wow.
interior design drawing, because back in those days, we didn't have AutoCAD or 3D Studio Max or any of that stuff they use now. It was all done hand drawings. And because of, I suppose, the type of personality I've got, I'm not very good at being employed. I've got my own way of doing things. And that job lasted for about a year. And then I got fired basically. And then I was looking for work, and I think I was about, so I must have been 17, and this job came up at a camera store, funnily enough. And I didn't know anything about photography or cameras at all. And I just took this job in a camera store as a filler while I was looking for another graphic design type job. And I learned about photography there. They used to set you projects. They were really good on guiding you on knowledge on photography. They wanted you to know all about it. And I just became fascinated with cameras and photography and the fact they could deliver these super precise images in the way that art took a long time. And I just literally became addicted to it. And I was only in that job for a short period, but from that moment onwards, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And then I had various jobs thereafter, some in design, some in photography studios assisting, some in photography darkrooms back in the day, printing black and white handprints professionally for a company. And I really wanted to be a photojournalist. I used to love National Geographic, looking at the work of Steve McCurry, Jodie Cobb, Nick Nichols, and all of the top NG guys. And I decided to go traveling with my cameras that I'd saved up for. And I went off around the world for a couple of years. A friend of mine shot loads of really good pictures and then put those forwards to magazines like National Geographic, Geo, and everyone else. And they were offering me advice saying this was good, this was bad. You need to focus more on the stories. You need to focus this, that, and the other. And then I went and did it again on another trip through Southeast Asia for a couple of years. And then I started getting work published, a lot of magazine work, newspaper work, and did the photojournalism thing for some time. But at that point, I was only using 35mm cameras and no studio lighting, just some speed lights. So I didn't really know anything about studio lighting at all at that time. That was in my early 20s, mid 20s, I suppose. And then I got kind of a little bit fed up with the photojournalism work because I was always working one job, just paid for the next job. And it, you know, it was very hand to mouth sort of thing. And then I worked in Australia and I got a job as an assistant in a big commercial studio for a while. And I just became fascinated by how they controlled light and how they manipulated light and how, you know, they would take something pretty boring and then make it look amazing. And that was it for me. I decided to switch my photography genre, if you like, into that world of advertising photography, product photography, and lighting, and studied that religiously. And then I came back to the UK, opened my own studio, and then over many years gradually built a client list from local clients in my area, shooting things like tourism, hospitality, food, architecture, business portraits, various business stuff for ad agencies. And then it just grew and grew from there, really. And yeah, and then obviously that led over the many years to bigger clients, bigger jobs, better contacts. And then in 2005, we switched to fully digital with the Hasselblad H1 after shooting film for many years. And I noticed there was this big 2007 because Nikon and Canon started releasing the first digital SLR cameras, which had all been film up until that point. And I think at that time they were like 10 megapixel cameras or something. But there was this huge fascination with photography all of a sudden. It just went like this. And I used to get emails and calls and saying, oh, do you ever run any workshops? Is there any way you can teach us about digital photography? And I thought, okay, there's a real interest in this. So I started to run some workshops and they just sold out. And then I thought, well, I'll have to put some more on. And they sold out. And I just could not believe the appetite for information on people wanting to know digital photography. And I obviously came from a film background. And so I just thought, right, okay, there's enough opportunity here. How can we expand this? So I spoke to some colleagues of mine that worked in media and video production, websites and coding and DVDs and all that sort of thing. And I said, is there a way we can replicate my workshops in a way that we could sell this to a larger audience? And they said, yeah, we can put that onto DVD, going back to what we said there. And we started filming and producing DVD courses for about a year, and then we released them. They became really popular. Then we started selling those to distributors that were selling them in Canada, USA, all over the world, Australia. And yeah, it just the education business just really took off, quite surprised me actually. I continued to run my commercial photography alongside that, but nowadays I still just shoot for commercial clients that I've shot for many years. I don't really take on much new commercial work because I've got a good base of clients that I've worked with over the last couple of decades, and the education business keeps us really busy. So that's kind of the whole backstory. Started from an interest in art and design, and then I suppose it was all triggered by that first job in a camera store.
Okay, so let's kind of dive in a little bit into this transition when it comes to being photojournalist into the studio, because like my background, I started as a wedding photographer for like a decade, and I had no like even concept about studio lighting, right? Like, like it was something completely different. I was always like a natural light shooter, how we call them here. And then it started kind of getting into the more studio, and it was like a massive shift because you have to just completely change the way of you look at the light, how you control the light. You actually have a control what you're doing, with the natural light. You have to just go with the flow. So tell me a little bit more, because one of the things which always like I was always impressed, like whenever I was watching your educational courses, that when you're doing is, and this is what we mentioned before, it looks kind of really easy, right? Like you're setting this whole thing up here and there, and I know it's a many years of tryouts, errors, mistakes, till you get to the point like you really see the light. So tell me a little more about this transition, and then a little bit more about your kind of learning process, like how, because like we can work with multiple lights too, right? Like it's a very complex process, and I know nowadays people want to learn this quickly, but it's not that easy. Like and then you have to take the time, you have to practice. It's like learning part is a one thing, but getting into the studio shooting and just trying things out, this is another story. So tell me a little bit more about it, because this is the most popular questions I'm getting from people, like, how did you learn this whole thing, kind of like, but it took me a decade to even get to this.
It does take a long time. I mean, when I started learning lighting, it was also in the days of film, so you couldn't even see the result until you got your final film back. We were shooting in the studio when I was assisting with large 10x8 and 5x4 Sinar cameras, and used to put Polaroid in and shoot a test on Polaroid film to check the lighting on Polaroid. So that was the best indication you could have whether you were getting close to your lighting. You needed to use light meters and everything else. But working as an assistant in a big studio teaches you very quickly the tips and the secrets and the techniques and stuff. So, that was a real foundation for me. And I'm also the sort of person that when I start to have a passion for something, I just really go for it. So I start looking at all of the intricacies of the subject and everything to do with it, and read as much information, test as many things, try as many things. So even before I came into education, I'd had 10 years of lighting experience from actually working commercially, shooting with light. However, it is a good point, because I would say for the first maybe 9 years of my commercial photography and using light, I wasn't to the standard, obviously, where I am now, because I was missing one particular piece of the puzzle back then, and that was really delving into and understanding the physics of light and how light works, everything to do with angles of incidence, caustics, the refraction, everything to do with how light is diffused, collimation in parabolic reflectors, how important all of the physical, the physic aspects of light actually are in understanding how to control light and which modifiers to use, or even which homemade modifiers to use. And you then start to go deeper. You're learning about shadow density, shadow fringing, and all of these minuscule little things that started to come together that took me to the next level. And that was all just through self-study and finding out these things and looking at it, learning from other people as well. And then a little bit later on, I was introduced to the work of a photographer called Tim Flack, spelled Flach. And Tim is a good friend of mine now. We've actually run some joint physical workshops together. Tim Flack is an absolute master of lighting and post-production and just narrative with his studio portraits of animals. But what he is a real expert on is on human visual biology and how humans and essentially the neuroscience behind how humans process images, why we like a certain type of lighting, or why we like a certain angle or a certain color or a certain combination of things, and even things to do with the gradations of where certain colors meet together and how they gradate. He'd learned a lot and studied a lot of scientific papers on that. And he put me onto some of those scientific papers that then furthered my next stage of knowledge, which was not so much anymore about the lighting control, but about how humans perceive and process images. And then when you apply the two together, you can then deliver something that's a little bit, to the next stage, because you already know the control now, but now you know when and how to apply it. Now, I would say that anyone can learn lighting to a really good standard, especially, the small nuances, getting down to accuracy by the eye of 1/10 of an f-stop changes, knowing when the light needs to move just a few inches to the right or left, or you need to change modifier. That's all perfectly achievable and possible, especially with what we teach. But there is that next level where you need to understand why you're doing it. Because at the end of the day, ultimately, when we look at an image, an image is a message, it's a story, it's a narrative. And people have to process the image, they have to view it and potentially understand it would be useful as well. And how long they want to look at the image for is a really good gauge on how good the photograph is. Because if someone just dismisses the photograph and turns the page and wants to look at the next picture, it's not held their attention, so it hasn't worked visually. But you can tell when people are viewing images, occasionally they'll stop and they'll look at it because something about it, there's something going on with the composition, the narrative, the lighting, the emotional aspect of the image that is drawing them in. And that's what you're looking for in a really good photograph every time. And there's not one thing. It's not lighting. It's not light composition on its own, or lighting on its own, or narrative on its own, or color on its own, or contrast. It's all of them combined. And when they're all right, then they stop in their tracks and they can't help but get absorbed into the image. It's not an easy thing to do. A lot of people, they think, oh, so-and-so, he can take amazing photographs and blah, blah, blah. But I always kind of think it's a little bit like music, in the music industry. You get a successful band or musician. Not every song they put out is a hit. There's an album with 3 hits on, and then there's maybe 7 good songs and maybe 1 not so good. And it's the same even with the top photographers. They have some images that really hit the mark, but by and large, they know enough that they're generally all good. So it's kind of like, even when you know all the stuff, it's not always possible to deliver the hit, if you know what I mean. But we know what we're aiming for.
Okay.
So it's that combination of the lighting knowledge, the science knowledge, and that sort of, basic neuroscience knowledge combined that I think will lead to really, really good storytelling with photography.
If I can add something to this, because right now I'm shooting headshots, and then the one thing what I've noticed, and this is exactly what you're saying, and I think you just like described this precisely. I think one of those things is like really hard to understand, why this image feels good. But what I'm trying to say is that it's sometimes not even the way we see it, the image, but how we feel about it. Because as you
Yeah,
said, like you look at the image, and it seems like for me that sometimes like our subconscious can, I don't know, just spin some, I don't know, informations or get us this like emotional
yeah.
hit, that there is something about that image. And I think sometimes it's not even possible to describe exactly what it is. You just like look
Well,
at
I
the
can,
image
I
and
can, I can tell you that a lot of it is
Mhm,
to do with human evolution from a survival perspective.
mhm. Okay.
So, when you think about our visual systems and how they've evolved from, early species as simple as something like a scallop, which has got a very rudimentary vision system that can only detect light and shade or a shadow when it goes over it. Our visual systems have evolved from that to what they are now. And the entire purpose of that evolution of the visual system is for survival
Mhm,
and for the progress of your species and the evolution of that species. And each species has got its own sort of tangent of image processing. So, for example, the way an eagle processes image is very particular, that's suited to hunting from the air. Now, our evolution system has evolved for hunting, but also for self-protection from predators and threats. So, for example, diagonal lines are very important to us, but they're very important if they come from lower left or lower right. Horizontal lines are not so exciting to the neurons that we fire when we look at an image, because horizontal line, in terms of a evolutionary survival process, is not as important. Because if a human was walking through grasslands, the threat that came from the lower left of something coming out the bushes at you, or lower right, is a higher threat than something coming from upper left and upper right. And a horizontal line is something from the distance that does not cause an immediate threat. So the way our brain processes images has a lot to do with our survival evolution and image processing. So there are actually key reasons why a particular line or angle in an image, a particular contrast level, a particular set of colors can actually make a difference. I mean, another really interesting factor is to look at your images. If you produce color images, to also look at them during the post-production stages, look at them in black and white. And the reason for that is that the way our visual systems work is we actually process contrast in a way that's far more important than how we process color. So if the image
mhm.
struggles to find composition when it's in black and white, it won't be as successful. It can still work because color can still override this. But if you have an image that works when it's looked at in black and white from a contrast perspective, and then the color, you put the color back on with that, then the image can often be more successful. There's other really interesting neurological tricks as well, where you can change the colors in an image. So let's say, for example, you've got a blue and you've got a red. If you put that image into black and white, and you can see that the blue looks much darker than the red, or the red looks much darker than the blue, you can change the saturation in one or the other, or the luminosity value in one or the other, so that when they're in black and white, they barely look any different in black and white. So let's say they look like they have the same luminosity value. And then when you put that back into color, There's still blue and red, but now all of a sudden your brain is getting really agitated by them, because now it's struggling to differentiate there's no contrast difference between them, but there is still a color difference. And this actually irritates the brain. So you can actually use what I call sort of negative contrast application by falsifying the contrast levels to look the same, but the colors remain different. And you can actually dot that technique into some images that causes your eye to just like, you don't even know why, but it's a processing in our visual systems where our brains actually try to process contrast at the same time they're processing color, because color didn't come into our visual systems until much later. Evolutionary, in evolution terms, our image processing was in black and white to begin with. Color came later into in evolutionary terms into processing, because it wasn't really necessary. I mean, you could walk about the world tomorrow. If I turned your color vision off tomorrow, you wouldn't get lost. You wouldn't, have trouble driving or doing anything. The only thing you'd have trouble with is identifying whether that red berry was the poisonous one or the other one wasn't, So that's where color came in. And that's why some animals use color as warning signs that are very vivid, like wasps and things like that. And we've come to use color as part of that processing as well. But it's not absolutely essential to our survival. It's a later part of the evolutionary part of our visual system. So when you start to understand all this visual processing, and then you combine it with really good lighting and really good post-production, then you arrive at images that have more bite or something about them that you can deliberately apply. Now, what happens, of course, for some photographers is that they arrive at this accidentally. So occasionally there's an image where they've got the contrast and the direction of contrast, the angle, the diagonal line, the way the eye moves around the photo. They've got it all right, but almost accidentally. And that's the image that everyone loves. So, but there are many facets to it, as I said earlier, because one of the interesting things is not just the lighting, not just the contrast, not just the visual processing. Narrative is important as well. So, for example, if I see a picture of a motorbike, that's a nice studio image of a motorbike, I'm going to be more engaged in it than someone else who's not interested in motorbikes, because the narrative of a motorbike is interesting to me. So the content and subject material is another factor that, will help. But obviously I can present a really well-lit image of a motorbike to someone who doesn't like motorbikes, but they'll still look at the image and think, oh, that looks really nice. You know what I mean? But if they really like motorbikes, they'd look at it for longer. So there's many factors to it. It's never one thing. It's a combination of things. And when you get them all right, then you're on to a winner.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying, everyone sees images different ways. When it comes to narrative, colors.
In terms of perception of narrative, yes, because we all have different things that we like. We all have different feelings about things, but we all still process shadows and light in a similar way, because the emotive part of light is often the shadow element. And the way an image is perceived has a lot to do with the shadows. Because if your image is very darkly lit, or your subject is mostly in the shadows and it's quite somber and ominous, we perceive things with dark, strong shadows as being a little bit of a threat, because you don't know what's coming out of the shadows. It's a difficult thing for our brain to process in terms of a fear factor, because it's a threat level. Whereas if you've got an image that has very light shadows, the shadows might be just as sharp shadows, but the shadow density is very light. So therefore, it's now taking on the air of a sunny day, but with a haze. That means that the global illumination is going into the shadows, There's no dark contrast that we have to worry about something coming out of the shadows. So the threat level of the scene is easier for us. It doesn't feel that there is a threat level there. So we process those images in a different way. Am I able to share my screen at all in this chat? Hello? I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yes. Yeah. It was a little bit of glitch, but I can hear you.
Yeah. Am I able to share my screen at all?
Yes. Absolutely.
Because I want to show you.
Yeah.
I want
I
to
have
show
to
you
just
something.
accept it, but just share what. Okay.
Let me just. Is it that button at the bottom there? Share screen. So
yes.
I'm share screen.
You have to just pick the window.
Yeah, I'm going to just share entire screen. Is it won't let me. It's not. Don't think it's letting me share the screen for some reason. I don't know if maybe you've got to agree to it.
I have to agree to it, but nothing showed up yet.
Here we go. Here we go. Right. Okay. I can share it now. So I'm just going to open a new tab here and just bring up my website. So, for example, if we take this image, look at the shadow density. So the shadows are quite dark, especially in around her neck. Her hands are falling into quite a dark area of shadow. The contrast levels are very high and the shadows are very sharp. So we know that it's coming from a point light source. It's not too threatening, but there is something about it that is giving it a little bit of an edge. Mm-hmm. Now, if we move to this image, the shadows are pretty much as sharp, but the shadow density isn't as dark. So now the threat level is much lower in from a survival instinct perception. Mm-hmm. And if we move to an alternative image such as this, which will feel very much more ominous, because something is coming out of very dark shadows. And that feels more ominous, more oppressive, more dangerous, and more potentially a threat level. Now, one of the important factors in that is also to do with the facial expression, because we read faces very, very carefully. So this image, for example, feels a bit more mysterious because we have dark shadows, we have patches of light, but we also have patches of colored light. We've got some edge lighting as well. So it's often to do with the shadows in how we process an image and how we feel about that image. Sometimes it's just the narrative of the image. What is the image saying? What is it trying to do? What does it mean? And earlier I was talking about the blue-red problem. So in this image on her body, the blue and red areas across here irritate your brain because they're actually set at exactly the same contrast level if the image was turned into black and white. So this part of the image is deliberately irritating because those tones of red and blue, if we turn the image into black and white, are very, very similar in luminosity value. So it's little things to do with the science, but when you combine it all, then it takes on a meaning. Here we're dealing with something that's a very, very soft light, doesn't feel very threatening, but we're engaged with the three-dimensionality because of the cubes and the pillars. But we're also at a far enough distance away from the subject that it gives us a different feeling in the image as well. So that can also affect what I call the threat level. So there's many factors. I'll just stop sharing there now. There's many factors involved in all of these things. It's never one thing, but shadows actually play a huge part. And obviously a shadow is the result of lighting. So when you think about lighting, it's almost like everyone thinks about light and lighting, and they're looking at the light and they're looking at the light. But what I'm actually looking at often is the shadows, because I need to understand what the light is doing and the look of the light, but equally I need to understand the shadows as well. So my lighting control is also very carefully thought out about how the shadows are going to look.
That's fascinating, because you know what, it seems like, and I remember one of those things which happened to me actually through one of your tutorials. So like when I started shooting headshots, like I was trying to absorb all this information, you know, how to make them better. And I remember I just bought it like a random soft boxes, because you know, like at the beginning you just like, okay, whatever I need to have, I'm just gonna buy it the cheapest way possible and try to make it work. And I remember in one of your videos you have this you break it down entire process of shooting, you know, headshots, and then how different modifiers affect the face. And this for me was just like, oh my god, like, you know, there's so much into it. And I thought, you know, you're gonna get this. And I remember again this entire discussion you had through the shadows about how they're affecting the face, how to kind of like mold the face with lighting. But I never heard this interesting informations about the shadows, how they actually affect how we absorb the image. So this is extremely valuable, and applying them to your work, it's definitely puts you in a completely different level. But not only, you know, understanding this whole thing, this is another story, right?
Well, you know, a lot of it can be learnt as well from cinematography, because cinematographers have been dealing with this for years. The way a good film feels is often from the lighting, you know, the DOP or the lighting director, if they've got one. And you can see certain films where the director has thought very carefully about the lighting and how it's going to affect the emotion of the scene. So a great example is, you may remember a film from years ago with Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt called Seven. It's kind of a horror film. But the lighting in that film is exquisite. So the control of the light, and you'll see it if you watch it, everything I'm talking about, shadows and feeling the danger of something coming out of the shadows. The entire film is shadows and use of shadows, and to create that ominous oppression feeling throughout the whole film. And then another great example is Space Odyssey 2001, in the closing scenes where the guy is in the spacesuit, but he's in that room, the very ornate room, and he sees himself on the bed as an old man. But all of the lighting on that one is coming from the floor only. So what they did is they put the entire lighting panels as floor tiles illuminating upwards. And that's because horror films often use upward lighting rather than downward lighting, because in the world around us, we're used to light coming down. The sun rises at this height, goes over, sets at this height. It never comes from underneath, unless occasionally it's reflecting off water. But if it is, it's also coming from above as well. So generally speaking, in 99% of situations, the light is coming from above, and that's what looks natural. If you take a torch and you shine it under your chin like a little kid trying to do a scary horror thing, the whole face looks weird. And that's what they did deliberately in Space Odyssey 2001 for those final scenes, was they lit the entire scene from underneath so that everything looked weird. But instead of it just being a little torch, they used the entire floor so that it was soft lighting, because it was a huge lighting panel. But the brain had trouble processing it, because all of a sudden, all of the sort of soft shadows, they were still soft because the light was so huge, but they were all backwards, effectively, to what we're used to processing. So people don't really notice it when they're watching the film, but that's what's giving that scene this really strange, ethereal quality to that final scene. And even though the lighting is very soft, it is actually very confusing to our visual systems, because it's not a lighting scenario that you're presented with in any other situation. So cinematography and good cinematographers have known this for years, and the way they, control and direct lighting in a film has a huge impact on our emotional perception of the film and the narrative. And obviously the same things are applied or should be applied in stills photography as well.
But what is interesting about what you're saying is, and this is just kind of hit me like right at this moment, that as you said, like you put the light underneath your face and you lighting up your face the kind of opposite direction that the natural light. Like we know it's scary, but we don't know why. And I think right now, from this evolutionary kind of perspective, that makes sense. But talking about movies, I think that's a great idea. But I think one of the challenge I think a lot of people might have is the fact that we feel it, but we don't understand why we feel that way, right?
Well,
so I think you gave this perfect explanation, like why you feel that way and why this is kind of like it's supposed to scare you, right? Because that's
I mean, if you think about lighting coming from underneath, the reason it scares us is because it's abnormal. It's unusual. It's paranormal in the sense that we never really see it. And humans and animals as well, the minute something is not normal, it's a threat, because we're not able to process it to know that it's not a threat. So if something is different to what we're used to, we perceive it with a sense of danger, which then, I mean, I was talking about my friend Tim Flack earlier, and Tim Flack is a lighting specialist as well, and he photographs mainly animals in the studio, but like exotic animals, from tigers to bears and all sorts. But he did a picture of a wolf once, a headshot of a wolf, and he applied exactly the same thing. He lit the wolf from underneath because he knew that the wolf would look scarier, and it does. But it's that knowledge of understanding what is going to activate neurons, in our visual system, knowing how we process images, and anything that is a threat, such as shadows, dark areas. Those things we will process in a certain way. I mean, there's a great neurological experiment I run on one of my workshops where we have a cartoon, not a cartoon character, but a sketch of a female face. She has a very beautiful shaped face, jawbone, cheek shape and everything. Eyes, lips, nose, everything is exactly perfect, symmetrical, looks lovely. And then we have the exact same image where the eyebrows are changed at angle downwards, which makes her look sad, and another one where the eyebrows are changed inwards, which makes her look angry. Yet none of the other facial features have been changed. But when you present someone with the three identical images next to each other, they always want to look at the neutral one. They feel sympathy for the one where the eyebrows are this way. They fear the one with the eyebrows the other way. And yet actually, even that very minute adjustment to her facial arrangement, which is only the eyebrows and nothing else, is enough for our visual processing systems to assess the threat level. So we are constantly, the minute you meet me in person, the minute you meet anyone new in person, your brain is processing the threat level. We're trying to determine whether it's friend or foe. And it's that visual processing is actually very important in portraiture. I'll give you another example. So let me share my screen again, if I may.
Absolutely.
Let's get. So I'm just going to go back to this website. So if we take, there's nothing really threatening about that girl there in that beauty shot. It's not she's not particular. She doesn't feel particularly threatening. Her expression doesn't in any way feel, difficult for us to process. Probably the same with this girl. Even though she's in the shadows, it's very neutral. There's no threat level there whatsoever. But if I give you, it might be in the overview section. If I give you this image, this is a little bit more difficult for us to process.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit more disturbing because all of a sudden you don't know what the hell is going on. Are we confronted with a psychopathic person that may have a knife behind her back? What is it that is causing that facial expression? And then equally, what I've done in that image is I've used that same control of color and colors that are difficult to process because the contrast level of the blue and the magenta are actually very similar. So whilst the blue looks like it is the shadow side of her face, it's actually not as shadow as it appears. And then I've also applied some techniques with processing around that. So the colors that I'm using, the fringing colors. But a lot of people don't like that image because they find it hard to process. But it was done deliberately. So, it's human facial processing is a very important part of portraiture as well. Because immediately the brain goes into friend or foe decision making.
So please tell me when you started kind of discovering these things, because I know we all process images different ways, and like I've been trying to also kind of understand this from not only lighting perspective or all this stuff, but now like we reaching completely different level of understanding not only producing the images, but also how people feel them, how they process them, and what kind of emotions we are creating, what kind of message we're creating for that image. Because it's really hard to find those informations too, right? Because like I'm not saying we don't talk about it, because we obviously have this conversation, but this is the knowledge which kind of like takes you to completely different level as a photographer, right? Where you really understand the psychology behind creating those images. So when you sort of kind of like, when you actually, my question is like, when you reach that level where you're like, okay, you know what, this is not just about the lighting and then all about, this technical part, but now you're just taking those images and you like literally molding them to something way more meaningful and something which, people kind of feel it the way you want it, right?
Well, that's a good point. I like the way you say about molding it to the way you want the emotional perception.
Yes.
And that's absolutely right. I first started investigating this, I suppose, back in around 2008 and then moving forwards. But it was really, probably about 10 years ago, I had a conversation with Tim Flack and we were talking about, the visual processing side of things. Because for example, is a great analogy. If you present a photograph, a really good photograph to a human, they'll likely connect with it. They'll look at it, they'll study it, they'll process it. But if you present the same image to your dog or a polar bear, it is not going to have the same perception of the image in any way whatsoever. The dog might have a little bit because dogs are tuned into human facial expressions because of the way they've been domesticated. But beyond that, not so much. Now, the reason is that the polar bear has no evolutionary survival requirement or threat or anything to worry about from that photograph whatsoever. It doesn't even need to understand it. The same for the cat or whatever. It's only for the human. So therefore, you can say it can only be a good photograph for the human. It's not a good photograph for the polar bear or the cat or the dog. That's obvious. But interestingly, when you actually step back from that and you think about that, you then ask yourself, well, what is it that makes it an image of interest to a human?
Mhm.
And that's when I stepped back and realized, well, it's actually got something to do with this more than this, or anything to do with cameras and lenses and composition and all those sort of things. I mean, I used to follow, like many photographers, when you start learning photography, you used to follow the basic compositional rules of the rule of thirds or symmetry and, you know, all of those sort of things, you know, leading lines, etc. Leading lines has got some relevance in that there are diagonals applied. But later on, I realized that actually composition is not a huge bearing on the result of an image. It helps a little bit. But what is the most important thing compositionally is that you go into the photograph, you go around it, and you keep circulating, and you don't want to leave it. That's actually the most important compositional factor, because it's the ability to hold the viewer's attention that dictates the success of the image. It doesn't really matter whether it's on the rule of thirds or not on the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a great learning tool when you're beginning, but when you get past a certain stage, the only intention is get them in the photograph, keep them in the photograph, and that's it. And how we do that is very important. But everything, as I say, I took a step back and I realized that actually then what we really need to understand is how people see images and how they process them. And then why do they see them a certain way? Why do they process them a certain way? So I started reading papers that Tim Flack recommended to me. I started reading a lot of other neuroscience papers. Tim continues to study this stuff. I continue to study this stuff. And it is all about visual processing and applying that visual processing knowledge to the work and the other skills of lighting and camera choices and, you know, everything else is what brings it all together, I guess. But as I said earlier, you know, I mean, there's some people don't like my work. There's some people that do, and not every shot I take is a hit. You know, there are many shots where you do a session. I'm aiming always for that winning photograph on a shoot, but not everyone comes together, because it might be the location you're working, you just can't get it to work, or whatever, you know, outside influences are going on that it becomes out of your control. Or, for example, in the studio, a lot of my work is product photography. I can't overly focus on visual human processing for product images for my clients, because they've got a different objective. They need to show the product and what the product does and what it looks like. So some of the time you can't actually apply this stuff, you know. You can just apply the lighting and the dynamics that you know is going to help it look good. So, you know, not every image can be an absolute winner, but it is always useful to have that knowledge. But it does start initially with a basic understanding of composition, a basic understanding of light. And I think my early days as a photojournalist helped this, as would your days. As you know, wedding photography is very much almost like photojournalism as well, just on a specific event. But you know, there are other factors that come into it as well, and I'm sure you will experience this if you're doing headshots. But people management skills, you know, this has a huge part then on how your subject is going to feel and how your subject is going to respond to the camera. So there are other factors that, you know, the whole envelope has to contain, essentially.
Absolutely. And also, you know, like, well, I can give some kind of examples, because this is what you actually would talk about. It's fascinating, because, you know, now I can kind of apply those things, and understanding some of the situations I've gone through with clients. I have this particular situations where, I had a client who, the shoot was great, everything worked really, really well, fantastic time, great shots in my opinion. And then I send them off, and the person just completely lost their mind. They just like, I hate those images. Like I was just like, okay, what happened, right? And like typically, a lot of people would take this emotionally, and then like what happened. But I was like, you know what? There's something deeper than that. And what was fascinating about this story, I said to that person, look, you know what? Just take a couple days, look at those images, show them to your friends, family, and if they don't like it, I'll give you money back, or we do reshoot. We'll try to figure out something what's going to work.
Yeah.
And within the next few days, that person called me back and say, look, you know what? I'm going for divorce. I lost job. And, like this whole thing, when I look at my images, I just saw myself as a completely loser and then failure. And this hit me so hard that I just like literally like spit all this, my anger on you. Right. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is it. Self-perception in photography is very hard, because people, when they look at themselves in a mirror, they don't see the same thing, because obviously the image is reversed, and the way the brain processes the images. I look in a mirror, I still think I look 25, but I'm 56, because your brain I'm still thinking like a 25 or 30-year-old. So you don't see yourself the way you really look. And then when you have a still image of yourself, it's even worse, because then you can study everything in minute detail. Because when you're in motion, the minute details are invisible, because the wrinkles don't show when you're moving around, the lighting is changing constantly on you, etc., etc. But all of a sudden, if it's freeze framed and you can move around and look at everything, all of a sudden there's like this, oh, I didn't realize that my face looked like that. And obviously the work of the photographer is to light it, to make them look as flattering as possible, retouch it, without making it look overly retouched or whatever. But even so, people have difficulties in accepting their own image. And what you did there, which is a very good technique, is to ask them to take other people's opinions on the image, because the other people will evaluate the image against what that person looks like to them. And then they will get a more realistic, sort of acceptance of the image and a more realistic perception, that in that case, as they came back to you. But also, like you say, it can be with whatever they're thinking on the day, or whatever else is going on in their mind. But there's not many people that like photos of themselves. Even top models that I've worked with, they're still self-critical. They're still going, oh, could you do that? Or can we do this? And blah, blah, blah.
I found even the more attractive they are, the more, I'm not saying insecure, because maybe that's too much, but they see all the flaws. And then
maybe. I mean, some of them I've worked with, they are used to seeing their own image so many times that they, it doesn't bother them anymore. But even some still like, oh, not quite like that. And I'm like, well, I can't see a thing that's wrong with it, But yeah.
But I also found that people have to kind of like digest, I don't know if this is the right word, digest those images, because with my work, what I see with the time, they like those images more and more and more. And then I have these clients who like they don't change the headshot for 5, 6, even 10 years, and I'm like, we need to update your shot. And like, no, I like that image, it's my favorite image, like it seems like this image just, I don't know, grow into them, or they become part of them, that they don't want to change anything. So that's also fun. And also what is funny, that those people didn't like those images at the beginning, and then with the time they started liking this image more.
Time is definitely.
Plus I also found that the validation, right, they put those images on social media and they get like bombarded with all this positive comments. It's just kind of like put more value into those images. That's another story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in the sense, I say lucky, but I don't shoot portraiture for the general public, so I don't ever have to deal with that feedback, Fortunately, if I'm shooting people, it is usually models or a particular subject to match a particular theme. So, but I can imagine, having experienced many years ago when I was shooting business portraits, for example, you often shoot businessmen and high flyers who think they look a certain way, and then all of a sudden don't like how they look, and you've lit them in the most flattering way, presented them in the most flattering way, and they still struggle with that self-perception. So I know that can be a difficult thing for photographers.
So how that applies for commercial work? Let's say you work for specific campaign or specific, I don't know, as I said, campaign. That would be probably the best idea. How because I don't know, you probably work with creative directors too, right?
Yeah, often. I mean, some clients, especially if it's product photography, I may be just doing the project on my own, sometimes with art directors. I don't often have to photograph people from a commercial perspective. And if I do, it's usually professional models, because they're modeling something like glasses or handbags or something, so there's obviously any issue there, because you're working with models. As I said, many years ago, I did used to shoot a lot of business portraits, lawyers, bankers, top city people. And you just have to handle and people management skills in the best way you can, and the best lighting skills, the best depth of field, but also, very, very much thinking about the background or the environment that you're putting them in and posing them in, and making sure that works to represent what they do, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Because you need to have the context so that they feel like they're in their world, and it makes sense for that annual report, etc. So there was always stuff like that. But I mean, generally speaking, it wasn't too much trouble. I always, we do retouching. Of course, all photographers do some form of retouching. I keep my retouching minimal. It's mostly just burn and dodge. So I'm not often changing anything in an image other than the tonality. But there's so much you can do with burn and dodge to change imperfections and shadows and everything else. Occasionally, if I need to, a bit of clothing is sticking out, or the shoulder looks big or something, I'll use a little bit of liquify to help the picture. And then some people say to me, oh, well, you're changing them. And I'm saying, well, actually, the camera already changed them. Because if you're photographing a portrait of someone and they're this way to the camera, all of a sudden my shoulder looks way bigger than my head now. But it's because it's closer to the camera, but that's not how our eyes process the image, and also depending on the lens you choose. So if you end up having to liquefy the shoulder to shrink it down again, you're actually just compensating for what the camera got wrong in the first place. Yeah. So I don't see those sort of things as being a major concern. I mean, obviously, if you change someone's whole face and head completely, then it doesn't look like them and they lose their sort of personality anyway. But I think, for me, it's always been a light level of retouching, and it's been more about burn and dodge, which is essentially contrast control. And then what I do in some of my fashion images or advertising images is I deliberately change color intensity in certain areas to make the eye look around the image in a certain way. So I manipulate color quite a lot. I mean, sometimes I'll take a lot of color out. So interestingly, there are some of my images which people perceive as being very colorful, but actually the color is probably about 50% of what it should be. It's just the choice of colors I've put together that has tricked the brain into thinking it's more colorful than it actually is. Because an oversaturation images, which a lot of photographers make the mistake of, actually becomes frustrating to the eye as well. So sometimes I'm reducing all of the color saturation in my images, but then just changing the color hue of one particular color in combination with another one, so that the brain processes the image differently, and that falsely actually makes the image look more colorful than it really is, but without that oversaturation processing that can make some images look a bit garish, if you know what I mean. So, but I think it's okay to change color and process color, because if it's okay to look at a black and white image, then why is it not okay to adjust the color in an image? That's my perception. I mean, I work. I mean, I just say I do my own retouching work, but there's a really good retoucher, Victor Fayesh, which you may have seen on our platform, and he said to me, we have to retouch, is what he said. Because this was the question I asked him. I said, why do we retouch? And he says, we have to, because photography is hyper realistic. It's not really realistic, it's beyond realistic. And what he meant by that, which is really important, is that if I take a picture of a model, I don't know, say wearing glasses or sunglasses for an advert, if that advert is going to be a billboard at a train station, some of my work I've seen, and it's 10 meters wide, which is 30 feet wide, by 6 meters high, and it's the whole model's head. Now that isn't realism, that's hyper realism, because no one has a 5 meter high head. So therefore, everything you would see in that image without retouching would have been invisible to the human eye. Every little pore, every little hair on the skin, everything would have been visible in a level of hyperrealism that would have made the viewer go, oh my God, So you have to retouch because of certain ways that images are presented that is hyperrealistic rather than realistic. And that was the important thing that he said, which I thought was a really good example and an analogy of why retouching is actually necessary for certain scenarios. Don't get me wrong, though. I think there are elements, especially in beauty images, where the retouching is unnecessary, or it's over-processed, or it becomes misleading to the younger generation. And I've said this before, I think it's quite clever what they do in some parts of Europe, where they make the advertiser label the image saying this image has been retouched. So you'll see a beauty advert for, one of the big makeup brands, and it will say in the bottom corner, this image has been retouched. So that the younger generation, their perception of the image isn't that that's how she looks, or he looks, or whatever. So, but yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with retouching, because I think, as I say, looking at a still image is very different to how we look at each other in day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think also, based on the science, what human eye would see, 2%, and the rest of it is blurred, and then
absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you want to, if people want to understand, if you hold your arm out thumb's length, the only part that is actually sharp in your vision is about the size of your thumbnail or your fingernail. The rest of it, if you actually look at your thumbnail and just focus only on your thumbnail, the area outside of that and into your peripheral vision becomes more and more blurry. And equally, the color perception gets less on the edges as well. So if you ask someone to, if you put an orange on a stick right in front of them, and then you bring in 2 more oranges from the side that are the same color as the orange in the middle, the saturation of the oranges in your peripheral vision, if you don't look at them, but you just look straight at the orange in front, the saturation of these 2 is way down from the one in the middle. And that's just simply because the center, the fovea, has got more cone cells.
Yes.
The rest of the image is more rod cells. So rod cells are designed for processing contrast more than they are color. And cone cells, which are right in the center of your vision, are designed for processing color and they're also far more of them closely packed together, which gives you sharper vision in the center. Now, the interesting thing about this goes back to what I said earlier about contrast perception. So a great example is that if you imagine a scenario where you've been in the dark for quite some time, when your night vision is adjusted and you haven't had any light influence, not even a torch or whatever, you'll notice that your vision is now slightly blurry and there is no color. So even if you were looking at a scene under moonlight, and moonlight, remember, is just reflected sunlight off a slightly gray-brown surface, but the light level or the luminosity levels are so low that the cone cells can't activate properly, but the rod cells take over and their sensitivity increases, especially after about 40 minutes, so that you get your night vision, but your night vision is pretty much in black and white. So even if you put an orange on the floor in front of you or a red football, you wouldn't really see it's red. It will just look grey or grey-blue, because rod cells are actually more sensitive to blue and then generally just tonality. So in night vision, we see pretty much in black and white. And if any viewers watching don't believe me, go outside in your garden on a dark night, wait for 30 minutes, put a red tomato in front of you, you won't see the red color. It'll be in black and white. And that's because the rod cells have taken over. And also the image will be fuzzier because the rod cells are not as densely packed together as the cone cells in the center. So again, this goes back to our visual processing and how our visual systems work. And actually the rod cells are those sort of more primitive visual cells that process contrast as part of the processing. Now, what's really interesting, though, is, as I mentioned to you about diagonal lines, what our visual systems are really good at processing is movement. Now, people think, oh, it's the movement factor that is, because obviously it's a threat level, something coming at you from here. It's actually not movement, because the cells are all there. It's the change. So that contrast just changed because something changed the contrast there, and now it's changed again and again and again and again. So it's the change in contrast that is the reaction to essentially, movement from a visual perspective is actually just change in contrast happening quite rapidly. And that's why contrast levels and the angle of contrast levels can be quite important in photography composition, if you like.
So speaking of that,
diversified there off onto
no, well, it's a fantastic conversation. But speaking of that, putting people in this kind of dark environment, I was actually listening to this interesting podcast a couple of days ago, where apparently, I don't know if you heard about it, but there's kind of treatments where they putting people in the pitch dark place. And I think you can start with like 3 hours, but like those most advanced people, they stay there for like 2-3 days, like in completely darkness. But what was fascinating when they were talking about the human's vision, the first thing what they said, everything turns black and white. That's the kind of the first kind of, I don't know, the way we see the surroundings. Like it seems like your vision's getting a little bit, maybe not better, but adjusting to this dark place and try to pick up any photon, whatever is out there. But what was the most fascinating thing, after I think 24 hours, your brain starts kind of creating images. So you feel like you see things, but you don't, right? It's all made up by your brain, just so you can see something and then you can visualize something, just to kind of keep your brain, I don't know, sane, or, just kind of gets into this kind of, I don't know, survival mode where try to keep you calm, that actually you see things. It was fascinating. I never heard even about, people do stuff like that, but apparently
no. I mean, it's an interesting, and there's still a lot to be learned. I saw an article, a scientific article, where there was a blind person who they tested and knew he was blind, but he was able to navigate obstacles in a way that indicated he had some sort of perception. But the way it was described, that his perception was using some almost alternative form. It was almost like the potential electric fields. I can't remember exactly what it was, but his own brain had adjusted, and some blind people as well, their brain can adjust so that they almost have like echolocation like bats. So I've seen stories where they can actually make noises and they can interpret the rebound time to know where things are. So it's amazing how our brain can change to process things. But it's interesting what you said about the brain making up images. The brain does that all day long anyway. So processing visual information is actually very intensive, from almost like a computer power processing into intensity. There's a lot for the brain to process. So what the brain does is it actually makes stuff up to fill in the gaps. So it will, it's based on something called imprinting, from previous knowledge of what you would expect to happen is what you will see happen. Because you've seen it happen before, the brain doesn't want to waste any energy in having to process it, so it just predicts it. So a lot of the visual stuff we actually assume as being sight is actually the brain filling in gaps and blanks. And you can kind of prove that because if, for example, if you want to question your visual system, just think about another form of vision that we have, and that is when we're dreaming. Now, most people dream, and most people can remember dreams or being in dreams that were very vivid, very accurate. They could see things around them. They could touch objects. They could sense depth. They could see color. They could imagine these scenes, these places, or walking along. Now, all of that happened and we could see it, but we didn't have our eyes open. All of that came from memory, and it came from situations that the brain was already familiar with and was able to generate images from a memory bank. And the brain does that even when we are seeing as well. So there are situations, I mean, this happens a lot in accidents, car crashes and things like that, where the witnesses will remember things that didn't even happen because especially at that moment with adrenaline and survival instincts, the processing was not engaged correctly. So the brain was too busy trying to solve how it was going to land or save itself, that certain elements of memory would be altered by imprinting and prediction of what happened or what you thought happened. So there's many weird anomalies with our visual systems that neuroscientists are still learning and understanding today, and will continue to do so.
I want to bring one more example because this is also kind of fascinating about our vision, and I'm sure there's like one, I think, particular video on YouTube about savants. So those are the people which this like completely different brain activity. I don't know if you've heard about those people, but they did this experiment with this one kid. I don't know how old he was, like 16 or 17 or even a little bit older, but they took him on the helicopter and they flew him around Rome. And basically right after, like, so there was just one flight, just to kind of like give people idea how amazingly our brain can work. And I think we all have, well, I don't know if we have access to it, but for whatever reason, these people can access some of those parts of the brains we can't. And he went on the flight, just do one round, fly it down, and they put him in the room, and he had this massive wall, and he just literally painted what he saw. And it was and this whole painting is with such a precision that even there's like a broken windows or something, his brain picked that up. So he draw this, at this particular angle he was flying, he could remember, that something happened. And when I watched this, I'm like, you know what it's called, this like a there's a name
Autistic.
for it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But the reasoning
Yeah.
behind that would likely be, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't categorically say, but it would likely be that his visual systems are far more acute because his brain is processing that because it is unable to process social situations and social environments and social behavior. So there's part of the brain that has become available to do this instead because it's
100%.
not very good at doing that. And it's almost like, how much computing power is there? So if you've got a computer power, but it can't do that type of processing, but that computer power can then be used to do this type of processing instead, it's going to be better at that bit than we are, because
100%.
we are doing lots of things. Obviously visual systems is one of the most important things we've got, but we have to understand and process language. We have to understand facial perception and threat levels, audio perception, calculations, distance, depth, and most importantly, social situations. We're a social species. We've evolved having to understand, working in social groups and perception of social, body language, etc., etc. Now, some autistic type people, and savant, whatever the correct terminology is for that, they don't have those social awareness or social processing skills that operate in their brain in the same way. Now, that may be because that part of the brain doesn't work for them, but it means it works for something else. I don't know the exact answer, but that would be a guess on that. But the social processing part of our brain is hugely energy consumption in terms of what our brains do and what our brains have to do. Obviously our visual system uses a lot of, if you like, brain power, but we've also got all this other stuff going on as well. So I'm sure it could be just the balance. In some people is more that way, and in other people it's more that way. In other people, like for example, my wife is not very visually perceptive. I could literally put an object on the kitchen table that she wouldn't even notice. Do you know what I mean? She's just not that way inclined. But her brain in a literary and language sense is incredible. But if you put something on my office or table, I'd notice it straight away. So my sort of skill or superpower, if you like, I think is in visual, in visual perception. But someone else might have less visual perception, but their skills are better in social circumstances or situations. So everyone is going to be different, and that would probably be the possible reason that person was able to do that.
So how much do you think that is training? And I'll give you an example in a second. And how much is like we are born with that kind of skill? Because like I remember when I moved to Canada, that's kind of also interesting story when it comes to the visual part of our brain. Like every immigrant, I started painting and all this kind of like low-end jobs just to kind of get things going. And I remember I worked with the guy who he was painting like very expensive show homes. And he was very like, he was making tons of money, but he was like really precise, and like his painting was like flawless, and that's why he was hired. And I remember after, let's say we have the, I don't know, we paint the room, and he was walking into it and he was like, okay, this is need to be fixed, this is the dirt, this like, and he was just like seeing, like, if you even paint over the fly, like a little tiny one in the corner, he could notice it. He's like, okay, you have to fix this because
Yeah.
there's the fly, paint over, and has to be cleaned up. And I'm like, how the hell you see this stuff, right? And I remember I was working with him for like 6 months, and he was so picky about, and I was started kind of like literally going with the light and just like checking every corner. And you know what? Within those 6 months, I remember when I was kind of visiting friends, or I don't know, going to different places, my eyes just got really picky to like literally checking the walls
Mm,
and seeing every little detail, right?
yeah.
So when you said about your wife, like has, well, doesn't kind of like pay attention to some of those stuff. But if we work in this industry, and I'm guessing you're like, I don't know, 30 years doing this, and then with retouching, with photo shoots, with seeing all the details, we becoming way more aware. And or, I don't know, maybe we also developed the part of the brain which is responsible for.
Absolutely. I mean, it's we become attuned to things that we practice more and
Yeah.
more. There's that old saying, 10,000 hours and you start to master something. Now,
Yeah.
there's already evidence in neuroscience that if you do a new skill, like learning to play the drums or piano or guitar or
Right.
something, and you've never done it before, it's very, very frustrating for your brain. It's really annoying. A lot of people give up because your brain can't process the different hand movements and all the rest of it. But eventually the neurons will start to connect and things will start to happen. So the doing and the practice does develop new areas of the brain. It does create new connections in the brain that then permit you to do that thing. So you became more tuned into seeing and spotting these things because you'd been spending 6 months doing it. And my visual systems are more tuned in because I've spent 30 plus years doing it and wanting to learn about it as well. So although my wife doesn't have particularly good visual perception, if I made a focus on it for 2 years, she probably would be greatly improved,
Yes.
So there is always the ability to learn and train. But yes, when we're born, we may have a slightly more bias to that direction or that direction or that direction. Some people are born to be more natural athletes because their spatial awareness and their hand-eye muscle coordination is better than me or you. So, or some people are born where their visual systems might be just that little bit more acute than someone else. And that leads them to kind of lean towards those type of things. Now, I don't know in my case, but I mean, interestingly, before I had glasses, I can tell you when I was in my 20s, we used to play games with me and my mates down the pub or wherever, where we would try to read the smallest writing possible, the furthest away we could. And I would always win. I would win by a mile. So my visual systems and acuity, my visual acuity was far higher than any of my friends. So clearly I had some sort of natural visual ability in terms of acuity, certainly in acuity, that may have been the
foundation
that led me in the direction of sort of visual information. Maybe that's why someone becomes an athlete, someone becomes a brainy scientist, or someone becomes an artist, or whatever. So yeah, I think there is always some sort of natural not advantage, but a natural sort of balance to one way or the other way. But as we know, when you start having to do one particular thing, then you actually will improve in that area. So, I'm not saying that someone who isn't maybe...
Do you think our brain is a little bit like...
Go ahead.
So do you think our brain is a little bit like a muscle? The more we work towards specific,
definitely,
I would say, skills, the brains, definitely. Okay,
Definitely.
so I was yeah. So I was planning to talk to you for an hour. We are like hour and a half. So I have one more question, and hopefully, I don't know if you agree to this, but why don't we make this part one, and then within the next few months we plan another one, because we just touched this top of the iceberg, the
Okay.
things I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
So maybe we can kind of redo it. It was a fantastic conversation. So and then like it was just like looking at the time, and I was just like, oh my god, it just kind of flew
Yeah,
by
we've really got
so
into a
quickly.
conversation here. Yeah, no, I'm happy to do a part 2 in a few months' time. No problem.
Absolutely. So my last question is, because one of the things I want to talk to you, but I don't think we have a time for that. But I want to talk a little bit about the business, because this is one of the things which a lot of people struggle with. So maybe we can leave it for the next one. But I want to, before we started, I want to talk to you a little bit about AI, your opinion about our industry, how AI is influencing, and I just want to kind of hear your, maybe not, well, whatever opinion you have on that. I would love to hear that, because it seems like there is two opposite um, ways of seeing what's happening in our industry. There's a lot of fear coming in. There are people who are trying to understand it, adopt it, kind of like go with the flow. But there's also a lot of resilience, and then people just turn this whole thing within some kind of hate. So how you see how our industry is impacted by AI, and maybe a little bit, if you could just share your opinion, what's the future, what direction we are going. Actually, you know what? Before you answer your question, I want to say that based on our conversation today, there is so much into photography, that I think it's going to take a lot of time till AI catch up the knowledge we have as a people, as a
Yeah, absolutely.
photographers,
I
and all
mean,
this.
I'm not going to give you the full answer now, because I think it would
Okay.
take this
Another.
conversation too long. I'll give you a summarized version, just
Okay.
briefly, but we can get into this more on the next conversation. So a lot of photographers are worried about AI, as are filmmakers, cinematographers, musicians, etc. However, if we take photography as an example, or if we take art as an example, before photography came along 250 years ago, artists painted portraits of a king or a queen or a noble person. And artists were responsible for making all of the pictures. Photography came along, but it didn't supplant artists. They didn't disappear. Yes, it was a new way of making images, but we still have people that paint today. We still have people that make portraits by painting via art. We still have people that paint landscapes. We still have that industry still exists, even though you think it shouldn't exist, because you can just take a photo. So why do you need to paint it? But obviously, there is still something to do with the perception of art that we like. That means it is relevant enough that it exists. Now, it doesn't exist maybe in the same level it did 200 years ago, but it still does. Now, with photographers, we've gone through many similar phases. We had obviously all working on film. Digital came along, so that meant that the amount of photographers multiplied significantly, but the professionals that had the knowledge stayed in business, continued. Photoshop came along. Photographers thought it was over for them, because Photoshop was going to allow people to do this, do that, and anyone could make a good photograph. That didn't happen. Photoshop just allowed those with the knowledge to improve their own work. Stock libraries came along, and it affected photographers' revenue for some period of time, because all of a sudden there was all of this abundance of images that clients could get photos rather than commissioning a photographer. But then all of a sudden, too many people were using the same stock images or the same sort of look, and people went back to wanting originality. And I think AI is obviously going to have an impact is having some impact on, movie, special effects, cinematography, musicians, but it's not going to destroy the creative industries, because I believe the emotional aspect. I mean, if you listen to some AI music, it lacks that sort of soul or depth or storytelling or emotional connection that some really good writers can produce. And I think the same for photography and filmmaking. Humans want to connect with real humans. That is how we are. We are a social creature. So I think AI will become a useful tool for some. It will take over some work, but I don't know yet which work. It's too early to tell. So I could get into this more, but I think in the conversation will take too long. But I think the problem with the only difference with AI, unlike Photoshop, which was a gradual, Photoshop version 1 to what are we on, like version 26 now or whatever, AI has arrived with almost in a year. It's arrived from a vision point of view. It started making some basic images, and now it can make video. Now it can make special effects. Now it can make like really complex images. But in many ways, a lot of them still feel quite soulless. There's some aspect to them that we can perceive, and we can see that it doesn't quite connect or feel real. It may change. It may be able to produce that in the future. I don't know. So I think it's too early at this point to really know or understand what it's going to do. But even if it can produce the most realistic, beautiful images that you cannot tell apart from photography, I think photography won't disappear, because there is still a demand for people wanting to work with people, wanting some level of realism, wanting their venue or their location or their product or their real service showed, demonstrated. So yeah, I don't think we're going to destroy. I would be more worried about AI destroying jobs for accountants and lawyers, because I think it's actually going to be the sort of white collar, administrative paperwork roles that AI is going to become particularly good at processing legal documents, or anything that is accountancy, numbers, finance, that sort of stuff. That those industries are going to be as much as a threat as the creative industries, in my opinion. And where it all leads, who knows? Because if AI does start to take jobs from people across the world, then the companies that developed AI, a lot of them rely on our revenue from our jobs to pay for their services and their products and their latest gadgets and iPhones. If none of us have any jobs, we don't have the money to pay for that stuff. So you change the global economy. The whole world changes. It's a new industrial revolution, but on a scale of something that we don't know. It might be a transitional period from where we are now with the workforce to somewhere in the future where it's some sort of utopia and everyone's on a living wage, because all of the work is done by robots powered by AI. When you think about what an economy needs, it needs power, a power source. So obviously in France, it's nuclear energy, nuclear power stations. Many other countries, it's coal power, oil, whatever. You need infrastructure, you need buildings, you need farming. So you need, the three most important things: shelter, so this is your homes, your building; food, farming, food production; and heat, energy. Now, if all of those three things, those three foundations, if you like, of civilization can be created for us by robots and by artificial intelligence, then these are three areas that don't need expenditure, because essentially a robot that can do those things can also build another robot. So, the whole balance of work life may change in the future. But I think what's really interesting is we're at this very interesting but difficult transitional period at the very infancy of it. And there's going to be a bit of hardship till we get to that bit where it might be utopia or it might be a complete disaster. Yeah. I'm not in any way qualified to say what it will be or what it won't be. I just hope, obviously, for our sake, that it's the better version.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's I agree with you. I think one of the things what I see, it's quite unknown which direction we're going and what might happen. But let's be optimistic, and hopefully this whole thing's going to go the right way. Karl, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. As I said, I truly enjoyed it. Learn a lot. Some of those things which I will definitely apply. It's interesting because some of those things you kind of feel and know, but when you describe it, you kind of put some visual element to it. You automatically kind of see this more clearly. So thank you for that. I have one more question because someone just said, could you recommend some books on that subject? And I'm guessing, they ask about this, the stuff what we talked prior, our AI.
There isn't any particular book or one book or anything like that. If you start looking online, Google has a lot of copies of scientific papers. So you can start researching neuroscience, visual neuroscience, and you can find information on a lot of the things that I was talking about. I think there is a book called The Basics of Human Vision, which I think I remember and I've got a copy of. But I think a lot of it is actually I've read from scientific papers, bits and pieces that I've collated together over the years.
Yeah, maybe this is the idea for a new book about
Well, actually, what, Tim and I did discuss some years ago about creating a book on visual science and visual human perception and how it applies to photography. And it is something that we've got in mind to do, but obviously given the situation with AI and everything else going on, it's not top of our priority list, but it may be something that actually becomes more pertinent and more important, given that AI processes images not from the knowledge I'm talking about. It's just processing images from other images that it's seen. I find it quite fascinating, actually, looking at some AI productions to look at how it chooses to light things. But the reality is that it's choosing the lighting of other people that did good lighting in the first place.
Yes.
So the unfortunate thing with AI is it's standing on the shoulders of decades and decades of knowledge of people that produced and created that work in the first place. In some ways, you could call it plagiarism, but then we are all guilty of some form of plagiarism, because I've looked at another photographer and I thought, oh, I love what they've done there, or I like what they've done there, and but AI has moved so fast that it has been able to plagiarize 50 years of the best photography and condense it into milliseconds. So this is an unknown territory. And we'll have to see where it goes. But we can discuss more of that in the next conversation.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. You know what? I'm going to end this stream right now, but just don't hang up on me. We'll just kind of wrap it up for a couple of minutes, and yeah, and then yeah, we'll be in touch, and definitely I would love to continue the conversation, because open up so many different doors, and I'm sure everyone who was like watching and listening was extremely, and we have like a huge group of people watching it, so that's great too.
Thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you.